because I can't stand behind one of those things. Okay, are we ready? Okay, good. Hey, I'm Derek Weeks. I am standing between you and a great keynote at the end of the day. I am a vice president at Sonotype here locally. We are not a security company. We are a software development tools company, but I'll get into why it matters to you as we go through this discussion. So let's take a step back, little step back and then a big step back. About a month ago, I was in Detroit. And Detroit as a city has gone through a lot of changes over the last number of decades, and they haven't necessarily been positive until the last couple of years. In 1982, in Detroit, they were producing 4 million vehicles a year. They had 15,000 cars rolling off the production line every single day. And it was line workers like this that were responsible for getting every car off the line as quickly as possible and put together. Right? They were incentivized on velocity. How fast can we get this product to market, out the door to the dealerships where people can buy it? So if you were in the last session and you heard, I think it was your comment about time to market, right, for IoT devices, right? Why are they going out the door so fast? Because we're focused on time. We're incentivized on time, right? But what was also happening in 1982 that was significant was that over the past 20 years, from 1962 to 1982, the U.S. share of the auto market was eaten by Japan. Japan had 5% of the market share in 1962. They had 25% in 1982. And over the next 5 years, the 5 major Japanese auto manufacturers opened a factory once a year in the United States to produce more cars to meet the demand. And the difference in what they were doing was really brought about in post-war Japan by a guy named Edwards Deming. And what Edwards Deming taught in Japan was that you can't build quality in or mass inspect quality into a product, right? If you're this guy on the production line that's inspecting the quality of some part that you're putting onto the car, it's too late. You're way too late in production, in the production process down the line to correct this problem. And there are stories upon stories of Detroit 1982 or Detroit 1975 or Detroit 1969, where if you needed to put a bumper assembly on a car and you didn't have the right bumper assembly to put on the car, you put it on the car. You put it on the car so the car would continue down the production line and 15,000 units would go off the production line every single day, and you would put them out in the lot. And if you knew that that was the wrong bumper, you fixed it in the lot. You didn't fix it on the line. Right? There was this idea that Deming was bringing to Japan in this book, or bringing to Detroit in 1982 to say you have to build quality in, and you have to build it into the process as early as possible. If you're going to bring quality in as early as possible and have the highest quality parts for the highest quality products rolling down the line that you're manufacturing at high velocity, then you can operate at high velocity with extremely high quality. If you just focus and incentivize people on velocity, you're going to lose out at the end of the day. Right? And this is actually applying more and more to how software is being built. Right? So if we look at kind of the evolution of software as it's being built, we're moving from the waterfall native methods of, when I started in software and our groups were developing software, we had a major release every 18 months. Right? And if it wasn't that big of a release, maybe it was every 10 months, right? That would be like we pushed out a big release. And then we spent about the next 9 months fixing that release because it had a bunch of bugs in it the way we were developing software. But we progressed to more agile types of development and DevOps-focused development methods, which are increasing the velocity of development at insane speeds. And whether it's an Amazon or a Netflix doing 10,000 or 100,000 or whatever number of deploys a day, the velocity of these of building these applications is getting faster and faster. And part of why this matters in the DevOps world and why it relates to the security world, we'll get into as I share some of the research that I've done over the past 3 years and I have ongoing now at Sonotype. And that is because people don't write software anymore. People don't write applications from scratch anymore. In fact, they build them from open source components. Right? And if you're not familiar with open source components or binaries or frameworks, right? These are pieces of code, pre-built code that are available on the internet. So if I'm a developer, I can just go to an internet-based repository and pull that component down so I don't have to write it from scratch. And we're going to go through and kind of shed some light for you on how prolific this practice is within the industry and how that impacts what we're doing from a security perspective overall through the discussion today. So 80 to 90% of the traditional application of the applications being built today are built with these open source and third-party components. Right? So the interesting thing when I was reading this book out of the Crisis from Edwards Deming was he was saying in 1982, when you look at the number of parts being developed by Japanese auto manufacturers that those auto manufacturers owned, right? The auto manufacturers in Japan were only building about 20 or 30% of the parts that they needed to assemble in their cars. They were working with suppliers around the industry that they had worked with to develop the best and highest quality parts for their vehicles. And in Detroit, the Detroit automakers at the same time owned about 80% of the parts manufacturing that was required for their vehicles coming in. And it was impacting the quality of what was being produced. So Deming was coming to Detroit in 1982 and sharing lessons of post-war Japan that said, if you're going to build the highest quality vehicles, if you're going to build anything, vehicles or other things that you're manufacturing in the United States, you need to pick the very best and fewest number of suppliers to work with to produce the highest quality parts that you need to put in your products. And when you use those parts, you need to track and trace those parts over time. So you have the best suppliers, you have the best parts from those suppliers, and if anything ever goes wrong with one of those parts, you know where it is and you can fix it. Think of Takata airbags, right? How do they know every single vehicle make and model that Takata airbags went into? Because they can track and trace everything through an auto supply chain, right? But these same principles that Deming was applying 35 years ago into the U.S. auto industry and that he had applied decades before in post-World War II Japan can be used and need to be used actually in software today and how we develop software. Because within all of these components that are being used to build a modern application, the average application has about 100 of these open source or third-party components in them. Not all parts are created equal. And I have the data that I'm going to share with you through this discussion today. The discussion is based on research I've been doing for the last 3 years. It's based on some industry surveys that we've done across a couple of thousand developers. I'll tell you about the survey that we have going on right now because I'd love you to participate in it, but that'll be at the end of the discussion. This research focused on really making the invisible visible. how many of you, other than Andrew here, because I've known Andrew for a while, know who Sonotype is? Anyone ever hear of this company? Right? We're a local company. We're like 100 people. We're not all that big. But do you know that we touch like 10 million Java developers a year? We run and manage the largest repository, open source repository of components available on the internet. It houses 1.7 million open source and third-party Java components for 10 million Java developers around the world. And when you're at Sonotype, when I worked at Sonotype, and I'm hearing how many components people are consuming, how many components organizations are consuming, and how many of those have security vulnerabilities or license risk or really outdated components, or the download practices from a supply chain aspect are a little bit nonsensical some days. Right? We knew this information at Sonotype, but it wasn't shared broadly with the community. So I put together something called the State of the Software Supply Chain Report. We're going to publish our third year of the report this year in June. I'm already working on it, but last year's report is what I'm going to share most of the data on. And some of the data that you'll see coming into this year's report, I'm giving a little sneak peek to. But what I was able to do was look at 3,000 different software development organizations that are using these open source components, and to also do a deep dive into the construction of, or the assembly of 25,000 applications that are using open source components, to give you a feel of what's going on in software development and why, as security professionals, you want to pay more attention to this area than maybe you have in the past. And when you see the numbers, you'll understand a little more about why that is. So, a software supply chain, right? This concept may be new to you, but if any of you work at a company or have worked at a company recently that's developing software, you have a software supply chain. Every software development organization on the planet has a software supply chain. And it operates like every other supply chain in the world, and that in any other manufacturing industry, and that's you have a set of suppliers. These are the open source projects that are developing components and parts and making them available. They put those parts in central warehouses like the one that we run for the Java community, but there's also one for the .NET and Python and Ruby and JavaScript, NPM communities. And those parts are then consumed by the manufacturers or software development teams who are using them to build finished goods or software applications. Right? This software supply chain ecosystem is very much alive and well in the software development communities on a global scale. And let me tell you how alive and well that actually is. So as part of my research, we went into last year this site on the internet that provides a very simple function called modulecounts.com. And modulecounts.com just keeps track of the number of open source and third-party components available across different development languages globally. Right? And through the analysis of their data, what we saw is that globally, across all these different languages or component formats that were being built, 1,000 new open source projects, suppliers, are coming online every single day. And of all of the open source projects around the world globally, 10,000 new versions of their projects are being released into supply chains or into the global supply every day. When I looked at just the Java ecosystem that Sonotype helps manage and keep up and running, we had 380,000 projects last year at the time when I analyzed this. Those projects released on average 14 times a year. Right? So the supply of open source components and capabilities that developers don't have to write from scratch anymore is very much alive and available to them to utilize. So, and it's beyond components, it works into containers as well. So anyone paying attention to containerized applications and the Docker ecosystems and the containerized application consumption, I was trying to get the latest numbers from Docker, but hundreds of millions of containerized applications that are built with these open source components are available and are being consumed, but also containers, if your organization is using Docker or other container technology, are being consumed in the same way. They're built by teams that want to containerize an application. They're put up on the internet in a place like Docker Hub and freely available for the world to download. And they're pulled down by development and operations teams to make themselves more efficient. Right? So software supply chains are not just running across open source ecosystems, but across the open source component ecosystems. So to give you a sense of how big these ecosystems are, when I joined Sonatype 3 years ago, we had just had 13 billion download requests from what's called the central repository, hosting these Java components. Last year, in 2016, we had 52 billion download requests. Right? If you think that people aren't consuming these components within the software development teams that are building the applications that you might be responsible for protecting, you need to be aware they are, right? And this is the Java, just the Java world, but in this chart, what I need to put on, but it wouldn't scale, is in 2016, according to Oracle, there were about 10 million Java developers on the planet. In 2015, there were about 10 million Java developers on the planet. In 2014, 2013, 2012, there were about 10 million Java developers. The number of Java developers is not increasing exponentially, but the component consumption, the binary consumption across these communities is, because why write from scratch what I can find freely available on the internet and download? If you're consuming JavaScript components or assembling applications in JavaScript, you have the npm.js repository, npm.js.org, where you can pull npm components. And this year's report, we're going to pull in more information from the npm community as I work with those guys. But they just had a 1.6 billion download week it was about a month and a half ago when I was talking to them. They're well over 50 billion downloads of JavaScript packages on an annual basis. At one peak period, a couple of weeks ago, for their downloads, they had 1 million downloads in an hour. Right? The consumption, not just in Java, but in JavaScript, is growing in huge amounts. This was just a tweet a couple of weeks ago from Donald. He's in Philadelphia, part of the Python community. Right? So they had 4.4 billion download requests with half a petabyte of content that they serve. The Python community, the NPM community, the Java community, right? The Ruby community, Ruby gems, they don't publish their annual data, but on their site, if you go to rubygems.org, it says right on the homepage that there are, I'll forget the number, but last I remembered it was like 8 billion downloads in the history of rubygems.org. The consumption is gigantic, and the population that's pulling these is relatively limited. So as I talked about before, all of these parts are not created equal. We're able to analyze the quality of these parts in different ways, from their licenses to their age to security vulnerabilities, and I'm going to tell you more and share with you more what I've seen about that behavior. So in the 3 years that I'm running in the report, and these numbers haven't been published yet, but in the last 2 reports, 6.2%, 6.1%, 5.5% of the components that were downloaded from the central repository had a known security vulnerability in them from day one. When they were downloaded, they had a known security vulnerability in them. And pick whatever your number, 1 in 16, 1 in 17, 1 in 18, of the components downloaded over the last 3 years, out of these billions that you just saw, right, had a known security vulnerability day one. Right? Now, why do we allow that? Because we run the repository? Because it's an immutable repository. Once a component is in there, it's in there. We don't stop it or prevent people from downloading that component. And the reason is, if you're a developer and you've actually used a component with a known vulnerability and you want to fix it by replacing it with a version that doesn't have that vulnerability in it, where the vulnerability has been fixed, you need to rebuild the original application using the original components. And if the original components are not available, you can't rebuild your app. The original components have to be there. For any of you that follow the NPM community, if anyone remembers LeftPadGate about a year ago, right? LeftPadGate was where it was kind of a crazy scenario. Some developer made a NPM package called Kick. There's a company called Kick, K-I-K, and their lawyer was threatening to sue this developer if he didn't remove the part because it has their company name. And the developer kind of said, well, this is being recorded. He had choice words for the lawyer, and this went back and forth. And then the developer said, well, fine. If you're going to be that way, I'm just going to remove all the components that I've written or the packages that I've written from NPM. And one of those was a component with 12 lines of code called LeftPad, and it broke like thousands of systems worldwide, build systems, within a half an hour because that part was pulled from the repository. And all these automated build tools were going to npmjs.org and pulling that part when they needed it, and all of a sudden that part wasn't available. Right? And oh, crud. Right? So you can't remove the parts when the consumption is in the billions. You can't remove just any part just because. The parts have to be there. Right? And the crazy thing about NPM, and you can read up on LeftPadGate. Yeah. Yeah. So anyway, they didn't have this part, and it broke all these builds. So someone somewhere said, I have a copy of that part. Let me give it to you, NPM, and just put it back there, and then we'll fix everything. Right? So did the original author contribute it back? No. Did some stranger somewhere in the world contribute pieces of code that had the same name and made it available to everyone? Totally safe. I'm sure nothing could go wrong, right? Anyway, worth reading up on if you want to learn a little more about that. So what do we learn as well kind of from the behavior of these software supply chains? Not any of your organizations, I promise you, has downloaded 1 billion parts over the last year. If you're really close to it, it may feel like it. But in terms of the Java community, the largest downloads I've seen across any particular organization is about 16 million. No, that was last year. It's 23 million for any one particular organization that we can track. But the average organization is downloading 229,000 components, Java components only. If you're developing in multiple languages, you're pulling in on average more than this a year into your organizations. Of those 229,000, around just over 5,000 of those are unique components. So if you take every component, every version that you've downloaded over the last year, only 5,000 of the 229,000 are actually unique components. If you strip out all of the versions of those components, you're only pulling in about 10 or 2,000 versions of those components. So when we go back to the practices and the principles that Deming was introducing to manufacturing and saying, let's use the best suppliers and the best parts from those suppliers, if you're using the fewest number of suppliers, 2,000, and the best part from each of those suppliers, you would only need to consume 2,000 components a year and not consume them 100 times. Theoretically, I know there are reasons why you're going to download more than once, but there are ways to actually store these components locally where you don't have to go and fetch them from the internet every single time you need them and to be more efficient. But within these 229,000 components, 17,000 on average of those, or 7.5% across these 3,000 organizations that I looked at, had a known security vulnerability in them the day that they were downloaded. Right? We're bringing poor quality stuff into our environment. Right? But that doesn't necessarily mean that just because we downloaded it, it was actually used. Right? That was actually used in an application that we shipped out the door. Right? So this is where we look a little deeper in the software supply chains to understand that last year, when there were 6.1% of the components downloaded had a known vulnerability, and then we analyzed, it was thousands, I think about 7,000 local repository managers. Think of these as local warehouses for components and packages, that just over 5.5% of those components in the local warehouses had known vulnerabilities in them. And when we analyzed 25,000 applications, in this year's report, I think we'll analyze 50 or 60,000 applications, 6.8% of the components within those applications had a known security vulnerability in them. I don't off the top of my head how many had at least one vulnerability. I think we have the data. It may be in the report. I'm just not remembering it off the top of my head, but it's a very high percentage. Right. Yeah. Yeah, so this was yes, 6.8% of the components across all of those applications, but it's not picking an individual application and saying how many of those had a known vulnerability. But if, again, I'll have to remember back to the first report if we had that. If not, we can put it in this year's report because it's a valid point. So this is pointing to a study. I'm going to give you guys a link for this survey at the end of the year. I ran a survey back in 2014, and I'm running a survey right now this month, through the end of the month. I had 3,000 people participate, developers and security professionals. In 2014, we're about 2,200 for 2017, and I asked them, how many of you have an open source governance policy in place? To say, basically, you're not allowed to bring bad components in, whatever bad might be for your organization, how it's qualified at. So 57% in 2014, we're at about 58% for the survey this year. Right? So there are 42% of organizations that have no rules in place that their employees know about for whether they can bring in good or bad components. Of those that do, and we didn't ask this question again this year, but in 2014 when we asked this question, the follow-up to the 57% was how many of you are actually following that policy? And 68% of the people that had a policy claimed that they were following the policy, right? So not only are we consuming massive amounts, not only are the checks from the beginning of the supply chain to the end of the supply chain not working, but 42% of organizations out there don't even have policies in place to say what you should be bringing in to the organization. So some of the data that comes back, I have to step back from the screen and tell you what this says. When we looked across these 25,000 applications, and we looked at the age of the components across that application base, this blue line is basically saying 1-year-old components made up about 18% of the applications. 2-year-old components were about 21%. 6-year-old components were about 7% of the components within those applications across that population. Then we looked at the known security defects within those components. So a component that is 1 to 3 years old has about a 5% defect rate, or at least one known security vulnerability in it. But when you get to components that are 8 to 10 years old, they're getting closer to 15, 14, 15% known security vulnerabilities in them. So when you're looking at things like open source governance policies, right, you're going to want to tell people don't use components with known vulnerabilities or maybe risky license types for your organization, but there can be rules that we can apply from this data to say, if you're going to use components, we're not going to prevent you from using open source and third-party components because you'd basically have to shut down software development in every organization on the planet. But if you use components that are less than 3 years old, and pick any version you want, as long as it's less than 3 years old, the chance of you being impacted by a known security vulnerability are significantly less than the older components. Now, of course, the older components have them because they've been around longer, and people have had more of a chance to look at those components and find vulnerabilities in them. But if you want to reduce the surface area of known vulnerabilities in your organization, you can control that more by controlling the age of components that are actually being used within the environments. So, yeah. No, you can't say that. It is, the older it is, the more chance there is to find a vulnerability in it. There is a vulnerability from day one, it just hasn't been discovered. It's not known yet, right? So the people that want to attack your applications or exploit it using these known vulnerabilities have less of a chance of doing that if the component is younger, because the attacker should take the easy path in to say, I know there's certain versions of OpenSSL, or pick your component, have a known vulnerability. So if I can find the people that are using that, I know the way in. If I have to find the new way into the newest version of OpenSSL, well, that's more work. I mean, it's hard. People know how to do it. People will find it, but it's easier to pick the known way in than the unknown way in. In theory, I don't know. I'll say yes for the sake of yes, but I don't know. It might just depend on the circumstance and also what it is, right? If it's a little component that doesn't have very much function, yeah. If it's a web application framework, that's kind of the framework of your whole application, I don't know. Yeah. Yeah.
Because you might be active.
Yeah. 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 So it's a good point. This research is made to bring up questions like this about how do we best manage. I don't have all the answers to that. Let me get through a couple more slides if you don't mind, and then I love questions. I just want to be cautious of the time and get you the data. But excellent questions. So this slide, if you've been trying to interpret it, will say, of all those components in the applications, 1-year-old components made up about 13% of the applications. We're on the latest version. So 1-year-old components, 13% were on the latest version. 5-year-old components, 14% on the latest version. 9-year-old components, 20% on the latest version, right? So quick translation of this is, in 2008, someone developed a piece of software that was so good it didn't need to be updated ever again, right? 20% of those have never been updated, or it's just a dead project, right? And if that's a dead project that has potentially 3 times higher levels of security defects in it, there is no newer version, right, available, right? So again, if you're going to pick components, right, to use and kind of have rules, whether you're picking the very latest version might not be possible, because the very latest version, there's 14 new versions a year. But you can't be on the very latest version, but you could standardize to say, you know, there are 100 versions of this component, but we're going to standardize on version 97 for this year, right? And everyone use version 97 because that will reduce our version dispersion over time, less variance in our supply chains. And when I looked, to give you a sense, in the first report, when I looked at the top 100 components that any organization was downloading, they were downloading on average 27 versions of each of those, right? So they needed 100 parts from 100 suppliers, but they were consuming 2,700 parts, right? So when you're going on the, oh my gosh, a new vulnerability in Commons collection was just introduced, did we use the vulnerable versions of that? Right? If you're using version 97, right, you know whether you're using it or not. If you're using 27 versions on average, you're on a scavenger hunt, right? And that scavenger hunt, if you've been on it, lasts for months, and you probably have some partners in crime that are working on it with you. So another thing that we've found in the research, this is going into this year's report as well, is one of our products at Sonotype is the Nexus repository. And the Nexus repository is, think of it as a local warehouse for these components that are being used by development teams. And there's the central warehouse that we run, but you can store these parts locally. And you can store multiple different languages or component types within these. But we introduced it in 2010. The local warehouse usage has grown over the community. We're now at about 125,000 instances of this. But there's a feature in it called Repository Health Check. And this is available in the free version of the product. But the Repository Health Check will tell you, out of what's in my local warehouse, do any have known security vulnerabilities or license risk, or they're really old, or they're not popular, this kind of data that's available. So the use of this has been growing. My laser pointer's not working. The use of this has been growing over time, which also tells us, and it's a free feature, it's not turned on automatically. People have to press a button in the product to turn it on. But the use of that's growing over time, which also tells us there is a little more interest in people caring about whether they're using bad components or not. So the use of bad components. It was almost exactly a year ago, Apple versus the FBI, right? You remember the story? Encryption, right? And fall on either side of the story of who you favor in that battle on we want into the phone, no, you can't get into the phone because we use strong encryption capabilities in the phone. So at that time, I asked the guy that pulls the data for me, I said, there's a component that provides encryption for Java applications called Bouncy Castle, right? How many downloads were there of Bouncy Castle in the last year? And I know that there are vulnerable versions of Bouncy Castle with level 9 or level 10 CVSS scores, right? So I published the data in last year's report, and I just updated the data for this year. So in 2016, 23 million copies of Bouncy Castle across all versions were downloaded. You want to guess what the 11 million is? The vulnerable versions, right? 11 million of the 23 million. Last year was, the year before was 33% of the downloads were known vulnerable. I didn't do the math on 11 into 23, but it's a little more than 33%, I think. 40 something? I don't know if anyone's good at math, shout it out. But anyway, so 11, there are perfectly good versions of Bouncy Castle available, right? But 11 million downloads of the vulnerable versions happened across about 13,000 different organizations in over 100 countries, right? So when people are complaining that Apple actually took the effort to put good encryption technology into their products, there were 13,000 other organizations that I was kind of wondering, like, somebody should talk about them, because when you're talking about using the best suppliers and the best versions of the products, Bouncy Castle, the project, is actually really good at updating their project. When there is a known vulnerability in their project, they fix it really fast, right? So if you're following and you care about using the best encryption in your products, use the best version of the latest version of their stuff, because the chances are they fixed the vulnerabilities in it. Anyone know Hollywood Presbyterian Hospital? Yeah, ransomware, right? If you were a patient there, you had to be moved to another hospital. Right? If you were an incoming patient, they wouldn't allow you to come in because they couldn't accept new patients, because their systems were locked down by a vulnerability in the JBoss applications that they had, and that vulnerable component in JBoss was Commons Collection. Right? So Commons Collection vulnerability shuts down a hospital. Right? Anyone familiar with the San Francisco Muni system? Public transit system? They were giving away free rides all weekend, one weekend in November, right? Because they were nice to their patrons, right? No. JBoss, Commons Collection, vulnerability, right? There are a number of other hospitals and organizations that were impacted by Commons Collection. PayPal, right? Search Commons Collection on PayPal, and they wrote their own blog on how they went and found the vulnerability across the 2,000 or so plus applications they had in their portfolio, right? So last year, there were 23.4 million downloads of Commons Collection from the central repository that Sonotype keeps up and running for all these developers. And you probably figured out what the 18 million represents, right? Out of 23 million downloads, 18 million were the known vulnerable versions of Commons Collection. Right? If you think that your organization is not pulling in bad components in mass volume, right, just take these numbers and share the numbers in a conversation with your organization. Right? So quality, as Deming said, going back to 1982, quality comes not from inspection, but from improvement of the process, right? We're not going to be able to manually inspect every component coming in the door. If you are manually inspecting every component coming in the door, and there are organizations that are, you have been outgunned in your organization for like 8 years. You couldn't keep up with the volume 8 years ago. You're not keeping up with it today. You won't keep up with it in the next years as the volume of consumption continues to increase, right? So what's happening is part of this. So across different organizations, and Andrew, you probably remember the years back with Josh Corman was working with the Congress to pass a bill about national cybersecurity hygiene practices, and part of these practices when he was starting to introduce them were you need to do a couple of things. If you're the federal government and you're going to purchase software, you need to require a bill of materials be produced for all the software that you're buying. Right? And that is, I want to know every component that's available in that software that I'm buying. And if it has a known security defect, I want you to fix that before you sell it to me. Right? Automakers can't sell me a car with a known defective product in it. I don't want to buy software with a known defective product in it. And if that defect is found in the future, if we find that there is a defect in something that we bought, we want you to fix it for us. Right? And that legislation was introduced into the U.S. Congress in December of 2015 in a kind of lame duck session, so we knew it wasn't going anywhere. but the language from that ended up in the Department of Energy, the Department of Defense, the Department of Commerce, 18F. OWASP has adopted this kind of language. The American Bankers Association, FSISEC, right? So all of them have started over the last year and a half to adopt this sort of language. The American Bankers Association, right, in their guidance was telling their members, here is the procurement language that you should put into your contracts in your procurement department to protect your organization by doing these three things, by following these hygiene practices. But you know what? It's not just improving the protection or the security of your environment by knowing this information and having your vendors follow this path. It will reduce your cyber insurance risk premiums if you follow that. That is in the guidance from the American Bankers Association. So if you don't think there's an economic value being touted to following these kind of practices, it's coming, right? The White House, the Commission on Enhancing National Cybersecurity, there's a lot of text here. I'll give you the slides afterwards, so no need to copy it down. But it's coming in terms of the liability caused by faulty IoT devices. We just had the session on malware and IoT devices, where you ship a product that has known defective parts in it from day one, and someone gets harmed by this, or all of my pipes break in my house because my thermostat was turned all the way down, right? That there's liability coming to be associated with this. And it's not here yet, but this is the recommendation that was put to the White House back in December before we switched administrations. And then the cybersecurity nutritional label, right? Basically, are there good parts or bad parts in what we're consuming? And if there are bad parts, we want people to know about this. So can you track and trace components across your infrastructure? So this is, again, a question. I'm giving you some of the data from this year's survey that we're running, right? But we asked people, do you have a full or complete software bill of materials for the software that you are producing, right? 35% of people that answered this said, yes, we have a full software bill of materials for the applications that we are producing. 26% said, yes, we have it for the key components, but not the dependencies. So you basically have an incomplete bill of materials. But yeah, like we know the big parts, like there's an engine and a door, you know, and a seat, right? But we don't have the dependencies or the smaller parts associated with that. And 39% said not at all, right? So 65% don't have a complete view of what they've shipped anywhere, right? So when the next Heartbleed or Commons Collection or Bash Bug Poodle, whatever comes out, and someone says, did you ever use that part and which application? Right? Did you use it? Right? 65% of people can't answer the question. If you don't have a software bill of materials for your applications, you can't answer that question unless you start to go on a scavenger hunt. And everyone loves scavenger hunts. So, automate, right? Improvement of the process means we need to rethink the human effort involved, right? You can't keep up manually with the volume that's coming out here, right? So what can you do, right? So I'm going to show you some of Sonotape's products, but there are other commercial products and open source projects like OWASP Dependency Check solution that are out there that provide similar kinds of information, whether it's an open source bill of materials, software bill of materials, or otherwise. But let me tell you what the future looks like for security, right? Security professionals can write the rules on what's good or bad in terms of a component. We don't want bad versions of Bouncy Castle. We want the good ones. We don't want anything with over a CVSS level 7 score to come into this organization. You can take those rules and automate them into the software development tools that your developers are using, and you can tell a developer, hey, inside your IDE, they're not even leaving the tools where they design in, inside your IDE, you pick this version of Struts 2 Core, right? Every column here is every version of Struts 2 Core that's available. Hey, The red, yellow, and orange stuff here, that indicates a known security vulnerability and a policy violation. This version has fewer violations, right? If you're going to pick a newer version, maybe one that's 1 to 3 years old, right, that doesn't have known security vulnerabilities, that meets the policies, this is your food label, right? These are bad, these are less bad, right? Or maybe good versions of the components. It's 0 time to remediation. I can put in the best quality version of the best part from the best supplier I've picked for this part. If you're running Jenkins and you want to figure out in every build that you're running, how many components am I using that have known policy violations? Those parts are old, they're outdated, they haven't had a new release, they have a security vulnerability, they have a GPL license, what have you. You could run this in every single Jenkins build or continuous integration platform build that you have. The analysis of an application, your average application, takes 5 to 10 seconds. This is not like static analysis or dynamic analysis that could take hours or days. It's a different type of analysis. But for these packaged components that are identical everywhere they're used, OpenSSL, the versions that were vulnerable were identical everywhere they were used, right? These are easy to find and easy to determine do they have a known vulnerability. If you want to produce a software bill of materials, if you want to see what a software bill of materials is like, right, take an open source, or you can visit this URL. I'll tell you how to get the slides very soon. You can take a product, a Java or NPM application or .NET application in this case. You'll get a list of every component in there, their popularity, the age, the number of years of the component, any security, known security vulnerabilities within those components. And if you don't want to run your own application, pick ours, right? Pick the Nexus repository. Pick Jenkins, their open source version, or another open source application you're using, and run that. And just see what it looks like. And you'll get a report. You know, it may have good stuff and it may have bad stuff, but you can get a sense of what kind of information is available to me by running this kind of report. So if you want the slides and if you want the report, my email is weeks@sonotype.com. My out-of-office message is on all day. If you email me, you don't need to put in a, hey, Derek, nice meeting you, great presentation, whatever. No subject line, no message needed. If you email me, my out-of-office comes back. It has a link on to SlideShare where the slides are. The report is also on SlideShare you can download. And if you'd like to take the survey, I'd like to boost us up from the 2,200 where we are right now in the last couple of days of the month here. You'll get to take the survey. We're giving away a MacBook and $500 Amazon cards to a couple of people. But you'll also, that will put you on the mailing list to get the survey when it comes out in probably mid to late March, once we analyze all the results that have come in. So that's about it, and I'm finished. And if there are any questions, we probably have time before the main keynote starts at 5:30, right? So thank you very much. We don't have a model like that, although you can. The way that our particular software works is that you define within policies what's acceptable and what's not. So if you had certain components or versions of libraries that you knew were acceptable, you can define a policy that says this version of this thing is acceptable, and anything that we see in design or build or release that is using another version of that has not been approved, then block it, flag it, notify someone, what have you. So we don't have something kind of out of the box that says you want to be FIPS compliant, use these specific policies, but you could certainly tweak the tool to, not tweak is probably a strong word, but you can modify the policies to follow that. You had a question I didn't get to you, sorry. Yeah, so there's certainly an argument if I go out and present to a lot of developer groups, and developers would tell you there's no way I'm using the latest version of anything that's out because it hasn't been tested by the community, and there's always fixes on bugs and performance issues and what have you. So really, when I kind of say use components within the last 3 years, it gives you some breadth, right, where you're not restricting anyone to a single version. And there's certainly other areas where you could apply certain policies, even to your own internal components. If you're developing your own binaries in your organization, you may even want to restrict, hey, we have 18 versions of this. It's not a free-for-all. You can't use all 18. We want you using version 17 and 18 because we fixed all the problems with 1 through 16, or we made it better. Why not use the latest one? Andrew, did you have a question? Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So the license risk for different organizations, there are every software component, binary framework, what have you, has a software license with it. And that license tells you how you can use that component. Some licenses are you can use it wherever you want, I don't care. And some licenses are, there's a beer license which says if you use this, you have to buy the maker a beer. There are more restrictive licenses that say if you use this component in any kind of distributed environment, you need to reveal your source code to the world. So some organizations, certainly that have distributed software, don't want to use those GPL type licenses. There's also, it's not very common, but it does exist. There are components that get released that have no license in them. Right? If a piece of software has no license in it, and they do exist, you have no right to use it. A software license is a right to use the software. If there's no license in it, and you put that in your product, and you sell your product, you are violating copyright law. You're breaking the law by using something that doesn't have a license to use. So organizations want to understand what risk might I have if I'm using a component and we analyze it and we say, and there are components and dependencies within this. One, I want to know it does have a license. Secondly, there's a license that the open source project says this component has a GPL license. But one of its dependencies that I didn't care to check has an AGPL license. The AGPL overrides the GPL license on the main component. So you want to know what's the declared license, what's the observed license, and what's the effective license, which overrides all of that. So license information is important to the lawyers, and most developers know, especially with GPL licenses, those are the most egregious. We're developing distributed software, don't ever use GPL licensed components, but not every developer goes and explores every dependency that they're pulling in with that main component. So distributor like LinkedIn, Amazon, right? If those organizations used a GPL license in their Amazon code, they have to reveal the source code of that product to the world, right? They would rather not do. Distributed like internet-facing, not an internal application. So if you have an application that you built to run your accounting systems internally, it's not distributed. You're not selling it, and it's not well. I will trust you on that. I'm not a lawyer either. Yes. Yeah. So yeah, so when development is outsourced to a third party, what I'm seeing more and more is kind of going back to the hygiene points that Josh Corman was had initiated, but have gone much broader than that since. Is that when I started this, like presenting this 3 years ago, and here's the data about what's going on, and I ask about software bill of materials, everyone was like, I don't know, never heard of it, right? But in every crowd, especially in the development crowds, when I've asked people, how many of you have been required to produce a bill of materials? Almost everyone, if you work in the pharma industry or healthcare industry, almost every single one of those people has to produce a software bill of materials. It's now a mandatory practice, and it's coming up a little more in the banking, financial services, and insurance side. So I think those practices that are kind of proliferating themselves in different government organizations are also hitting the private sector where they're saying if I have a third party developing software for us, I need a bill of materials produced so that I know what's in it, because I want to understand, do I have any liability related to this or any risk related to what I'm being served. The components, the versions of the components, all of the dependencies, whether they're direct or transitive dependencies, you want to know every single thing associated with that, because when you run the software, it's all there. All the dependencies should be there within the application. So you want to know the full scope of those. And from a security aspect, it's a little easier to discern good versus bad. There's a known vulnerability, or there's not a known vulnerability. With these open source components, there will of course be new vulnerabilities that crop up over time. And what you want to do is have a record of, what did we get from ABC company that we put in our product and then shipped off to whoever bought it, right? Like, did we ever use that component? Did any of our suppliers ever use that component? And you can get to, the bill of materials is the easiest way to start, because at least you have a record of what's being used. Then if you want to get to automated ways to prevent or protect against using those in your own organization, there are the automated tools that are coming out. And the automated tools are going to become commonplace, because if anyone cares about this, you can't keep up with a manual practice, and you can't lock down your organization tight enough to allow these, to not allow components to come in. And we work with there is a very big company within 5 miles of here that I've worked with that has thousands of developers, and they said, we are totally locked down, right? We are not allowing any open source third-party components to come into our development operations, because we run a huge, I won't reveal the industry because you'd probably guess it, but we're a very big company. And we don't want anything vulnerable in our system, so they had approved 800 components within their open source governance group. And a new version of a new component would take 12 weeks for approval, and a new version of an existing approved component would take 6.5 weeks, right? And they were sure they were doing a good job. And we analyzed their application environment, and we found out they had 8,000 open source components within their application portfolio. And that's because 6.5 to 12 weeks for a developer to wait for security or open source governance groups to approve a project is way too long. My sprint's only 2 weeks. Like, the car is coming down the production line. I have a bumper. I'm putting the bumper on the car. Like, if you're going to tell me 6 weeks from now that bumper was bad, dude, like, I met my objective. The product shipped, right? We finished our sprint, right? Yes. Minimizing the number of versions. I mean, it's I brought it back to in past years when I've been talking about this. Like, a Honda Accord, right? In this 2017 model year Honda Accord, there is one muffler, right? Only one muffler from one supplier on the Honda Accord, right? They do that because they're producing at high volume, they want high quality, and they're minimizing variance within their software, within their supply chains, right? Software actually benefits from moving at higher velocity by reducing the variability in the system, and just what you're talking about. There's a benefit not just from a security perspective, but just from a manageability perspective to reduce technical debt, reduce security debt and those things by taking these practices that are decades old from the manufacturing industry and being able to apply them into software. And again, part of why I produced this report and share this data is if you knew what I saw if you could see what I saw every day, you might think we need to do something about it. So I said, I want to find a way to reveal this data in a way that doesn't incriminate any particular organizations for bad behavior, but just say, here's kind of the standard practice of what's happening. If you didn't know it was happening in this volume, then certainly you're now more aware. They're telling me to wrap up, but I will answer questions wherever they let me answer.